impact.
Living in our memory.
Hey guys, welcome in, and it is good to have you in today for a very special impact. Today, we have our favorite, that's Pete Garcia.
And am I born to die, to lay this body down, and must my trembling spirit.
And I asked Pete really at the last second, and Pete, I really appreciate you doing this because I'm getting so many questions. People know something is going on in the world. Even Joe Rogan is reading out of the book of Revelation, who Joe Rogan is basically an atheist, reading out of the book of the Revelations going, man, this sounds like this is what's going on. And so even guys that are functioning atheists know something's going on. They know something's going on in the world. And I'm titling this, The World is Burning. And I took this from Luke chapter number 12, verse 49. This is Jesus talking. This is the red letters, guys. This is Jesus. And he says, I have come to bring fire on the earth, and how I wish it were already kindled. Now, when you look at this and you really start to figure this thing out, what Jesus is saying, but you've really got to read further, because then everything comes in context, because he says, but I have a baptism to undergo, and what constraint I'm under until it is completed. So this is Jesus. This is God. John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And we know that all things were made by Jesus. In the beginning, that's the one, the creative arm of God. And so Jesus is the creative arm. He's come to earth, and he's put himself under a constraint. This is God constraining himself. Am I right, Pete? I mean, this is amazing to me, because look what he says. He says, I've come to bring fire on the earth. Now, we know the earth was destroyed the first time by water. And the second time, or the last time it's going to be done away with, is by fire. And so he is literally, I love what you said, while we were just talking a minute ago. This is Jesus saying, I have come to bring fire on the earth. In other words, this is going to happen one day. This is all going to come to an end. And he's saying, and I wish it were, in other words, I wish I was already lighting the match. I mean, that's literally what he's saying. I wish it were already kindled. He wants the end of sin. He wants to collect his bride, Israel, his people. He wants this. I mean, he wants it, right? He wants it bad. This is God longing for that. And I love what he says, because this is Jesus, literally, this is God constraining himself. But I have a baptism to undergo. In other words, I'm going to go secure your eternity. I'm going to die. I'm going to be beaten, bruised, battered, crucified, buried in a borrowed tomb, and then I'm going to raise from the dead. And it's okay. And I'm going to raise from the dead. And when I do, that's going to start the clock ticking to the end of time. Pete, we're calling this The World is Burning, and man, it sure seems like it. What is going on?
Yeah, that passage mirrors there in Luke 12 mirrors Matthew 10, where Christ is talking about this division that he's going to bring. The message that Christ brings to a sinful and sin-stricken world that's engulfed in darkness and ruled over by Satan is this message of truth, light, and hope, and it brings division. And I think that Christ, looking ahead through the ages and all the time that would transpire between his baptism, which is the cross ultimately,
Yes.
um, and the time when everything is done at his second coming. I think he longs for that day, and I think he wishes that it were, as he mentions there, he wishes it was already kind of done. He's already lighting the match on it.
Yeah,
Um,
that's amazing.
and you see that same sentiment in the Last Supper, where he's sitting around with his 11 disciples that Judas, I believe, already left. And he says, here's the bread, it represents my body. Here's the wine, represents my blood. And he goes, I will not drink this anew with you again until we drink it in the kingdom together. So
Mm.
I know that this this is something the Lord greatly desires, to bring all of this chaos and craziness to the end. But Jesus also told us that as we draw near to the end, that there would be markers, there would be signs of the times that would kind of give us an idea where we were on God's calendar. And I think that the idea of the birth pangs, like Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse, he lays out, his disciples ask him, like, hey, what are the signs of the end and your coming and all this? And so Jesus gives them all these kind of signs, like wars, rumors of wars, earthquakes, pandemics. People are going to grow cold and callous and wicked and so forth. But he didn't just leave it at that. He said that it would be like birth pangs, and if you've had children or had a child yourself with a wife, she goes through the trimester. So the first trimester, it's pretty much roses and everything's good. Everybody's excited. The second trimester, you start to, towards the end of that, you start to get some Braxton Hicks contractions. And at the third trimester, it starts getting intensifying with the frequency and the intensity of those labor pains, ultimately to the point to where she's dilated and she's in some severe pain. And that child's coming. So I think we're in that last stage. We're in the last trimester, right before the birth, and we're starting to see these things happen in the world, just as Jesus laid out. The birth pangs, and so natural disasters, conflicts, wars, pandemics, the unrest of the nations, signs in the heavens. I mean, there's all manner of things that Jesus in the Bible lays out as well. And I think that what we're seeing here in Israel is it's just, in my mind, it's a starting point. Is things are only going to intensify from here on out. So, um, go ahead.
Pete, let me ask you real quickly. Um, so God's time clock, in history, God's time clock, if we want to know what's going on, we gauge it by the nation of Israel, correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So go ahead. What's that?
I was just going to say that the common euphemism or phrase that people kind of associate with this is that Israel is the hour hand, Jerusalem is the minute hand, and then the temple is the second hand. So when you look at when we look at in terms of time and where we are on God's calendar, for millennia, Christians had really no way to know where they were, because we've always had wars, we've always had earthquakes, we've always had all these other things happening.
Right.
But it wasn't until Israel came back into her land as a nation again that we can finally realize where we are. And I think in 1948 we were 1 hour to midnight, and then when they retook Jerusalem, we're just ticking closer and closer until the time comes to its end. And the
Yeah.
bad thing is, I think Satan knows that as well, which is why he's ramping up all of this chaos and destruction and violence to prevent it from happening, because he doesn't want Bible prophecy to be fulfilled.
Yeah. When we are looking at what is going on now, where do you feel like we are prophetically? Let's just establish this. We talked about the rapture in a previous video. And I know we don't have a lot of time to go over everything about the rapture, but the rapture is the catching away of the children of God, those that are true believers of Jesus Christ, the Messiah, those people who have put their faith and trust in Jesus. they are going to be captured away. And of course, we know that the Bible tells us that people are going to scoff at this truth now. And we've truly come to that age where people are scoffing, wait a minute. You guys have been saying that for thousands of years. Come on. First place, that's just historical. Jesus, Discovery Channel tells us that. They even think they know where his family's tombs and burials are. Jesus was married, he had kids, blah, 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 blah. He didn't die, actually. He just fainted on the cross and, etc. Everything you can possibly think of. But the rapture is really going to happen. It's probably going to shock a lot of Christians. I mean, I think we're all going to, at some level, be like, wow, this is actually happening, I mean, there's got to be some level of that, because even though we put our faith and trust in Jesus for our eternity for the forgiveness of sins, we walk and see through a glass darkly. When these events happen and we are seeing all of the things line up, when this event happens, we're all going to be in a little bit of shock. I would think so. I mean, I'm guessing. I got news for you. I think I'm going to be like, whoa, what? What? I mean, I think so. But we live in such a culture where the devil is making everything like it's this, like there's a cloud over it, and you can't see anything clearly. You're not, and so we're seeing even people, like I was saying, we're seeing people that don't know Jesus, that don't profess to be Christians, who are going, dude, something's going on. Something's going on. I heard this story of a lady from the Middle East, and this is relevant, and I'll tell you why. She became a Christian over in the Middle East. She was abused. She was beaten, almost killed for her faith. And God opened the door for her and her husband to move to the United States. She was here less than 6 months, and she told her husband, she goes, I think we have to go back. And he said, go back? You were almost killed over there for being a Christian. She goes, I'm anemic here. There's a cloud over me here. I don't feel passion. I'm falling asleep here. And she literally talked about longing to go back to the Middle East, where her faith was not lulled to sleep and be. And so we're talking mainly to people in the United States. These guys, our guys in the United States here. Pete, we all know something's going on. Tell us what's happening in Jerusalem, where it puts us on the clock, because I think Jesus is at the door, man. I think we're getting so close. It's time, guys. The world is burning. You see it in front of you. Don't be lulled to sleep. Don't just every day go to the gym, have your fun, forget. There are real things happening prophetically. The timeline is ticking. It's coming to an end. Yes, we have to live our life, but man, we've got to wake up. Where are we, man?
I was at that prophecy conference in Oklahoma last weekend, or the 7th and 8th. And that Friday, the world was one way. It was kind of like the day before 9/11.
Right.
And we were just going through the presentations, and people were talking about the signs of the times and all that. And you had, speakers everywhere talking. But then that night and early in the morning, my phone was blowing up. Everybody else's phones were blowing up that Israel has just been attacked. And when I first heard the news, I thought, well, they're always fighting. They're always shooting rockets back and forth. I didn't know the scale of it until later on that morning as the news started to unfold. And, it started out with, 300 dead. And then I think it's upwards of 12 to 1,300 were killed on that day.
13, 1,400 right now, right?
Yeah, and like 200 kidnapped. And I mean, it was just absolutely mind-blowing what had just transpired. And so all of us guys that were there and gals were, people that are pretty well read on prophecy were like, well, what is this? What does this mean? And immediately to me, it jumped out that Psalm 83 that passage that Bill Salas, popularized a few, I don't know, 15 years or so ago,
Right.
um, about the immediate neighbors for Israel, the Arab neighbors immediately surrounding Israel, would try and wipe her out from being a nation. And there's different opinions on this. I'm of the opinion that this is a Psalm 83 event, and it'll lead to Isaiah 17, which will be the catalyst somewhere down the road in a year or two, or maybe a little bit longer, for Ezekiel 38. And I'll go through all those in a second. But let me just give a little bit of historical context for the audience, because I don't know who is really read up on this whole Israel Palestine thing,
Right.
and the Palestinians, et cetera, et cetera. But the Jews, we call them the Jews, but really the Jewish people in the Bible were first called the Hebrews, and then Abraham was the first guy that was called a Hebrew, and literally it means one that crosses over the river. So God calls Abram, his name is Abram at the time. He's a Gentile. He's living in the land of Ur. It's somewhere in Iraq, somewhere in that area. God tells him, "Hey, I want you to leave here, leave your family, and I want you to go to this place that I'm gonna give to you." And so he leaves. Abram's a wealthy man. He takes his whole entourage, family, cousins, everybody, and they go and they make their way to the land of Canaan, which is what we call Israel today. Now, Canaan was a grandson of Noah, and he was basically an illegal squatter on that land. He took over that land, and it wasn't given to him. It was given to the son um, Shem. And
Mm-hmm.
so Canaan was a grandson of like Ham, so the other one of the other three sons of Noah. So Abram goes over to the land. He's there for a while, and basically in Genesis 12, God makes this promise with him, and it's an unconditional covenant, meaning, and we see this unconditional covenant really played out in Genesis 15, but it means that God's going to bless him despite Abraham, despite everything that God already knows what's going to happen in the future. God's going to do this for him. And the passage in particular that I think is pertinent for what we're seeing today is Genesis 12:3, where God tells him, I'm going to give you the land. I'm going to make your descendants like the stars in the sky. I mean, you won't be able to count them. And and through you, I'm going to bless every nation, right? Because Jesus ultimately would come through the line of Abraham. And
Right.
so the last passage there in verse 3, it says, "And I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you." And that has never been rescinded, right?
Right.
Later on, I don't know, 600, 800 years later, you get Moses who's writing all this down. Moses enters into what we call a conditional covenant, which was the law. God tells the Israelites then, if you follow my commands, if you obey me, blah, 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 I will bless you. If you do not follow my commands, you start worshiping idols and in chasing after the pagans, I'm going to curse you. And I'm going to use these other nations to punish you. And so back to Abraham, we could trace Jewish history to the land of Israel today. We can trace that back 4,000 years at least, and maybe more, depending on exactly when Abraham lived there. But at least 4,000 years. So there was a historical precedence that the Jews have to the land. Um, we know around the year 1000, King David, uh, actually, well, him before him, Saul, was the king of Israel, the first king of Israel. He basically had the united nation of both the northern half, which was called Israel, and the southern half, which was called Judea. And in those, you had the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, around in Solomon's day, at the end of after Solomon died, so Solomon was David's son. He died around 970 BC, I believe. He His sons divided the kingdom up into two. There was
Right.
Israel in the north with 10 tribes, and there was Judah in the south with two tribes. And Judah would have encapsulated Jerusalem as well. And so that was the way it was for a couple hundred years. And in around 722 BC, the Assyrians under Tiglath-Pileser, the third, I believe, and Sargon the second, and then there was Sennacherib. These were all Assyrian kings, and they had like a 20-year conquest to take over Israel, and they finally finished it by 722 BC. And those 10 northern tribes were scattered. They were called the 10 lost tribes of Israel.
Right.
Don't know really where they were, but they were scattered throughout the world and taken into made slaves and all that kind of stuff. So 100 years or so later, the Babylonians came in and conquered Judah, and that began in 605 BC and finished in 586 BC. And that was under Nebuchadnezzar. And this is where we get the story of Daniel, the lion's den. Ezekiel, the prophet, was during this time. Jeremiah was at the very beginning of it, prophesying what was going to happen.
Right.
And so that they were in captivity there for 70 years, exactly from 586 to 516, from when they were able to go back and rebuild their temple in Jerusalem around 516 BC. Now, the Persians conquered the Babylonians in 539. Cyrus the second, who a lot of folks in Israel would liken like Donald Trump to Cyrus in terms of recognizing the capital of Jerusalem as Israel's eternal capital, moving the embassy there, et cetera, et cetera. They've likened him. They even made a coin with him on, one side it's Cyrus the second, the other side's Trump,
Yeah.
with um, the last great Gentile leader to recognize Jerusalem as the eternal capital of Israel. Well, 516, the Jews began to go back, rebuild their temple under Zerubbabel and I believe Joshua. And about, I don't know, 100 years or so after that, you have a guy named Nehemiah. In the book of Nehemiah is an Old Testament book. He was a cupbearer to the king Artaxerxes, the Persian king Artaxerxes. So if you've seen the movie 300, we know that king in that movie, I don't know if he was Artaxerxes the first or the second, but it's one of those two.
Right.
But he was a cupbearer. He basically would drink everything before the king drank it to make sure it wasn't poisoned. And so he was there for a while, but eventually he was becoming very vexed at he was hearing news back from Jerusalem and Israel, that area over there, that although the temple was built, the city was still largely in ruin, and the walls hadn't been rebuilt. The city was still kind of rubble everywhere. So he asked the king. The king allows him to go back and rebuild the city and the walls. That started what we know as Daniel's 70 weeks. These are 70 weeks of years, or 490 years that God would give the nation of Israel. Now, I don't want to, I'm going to simplify it in a way that most folks can understand. This is 70 weeks of years is 490 years. These are 30-day months, 12-month years.
Yeah.
So exactly 360-day years. And from the time that Nehemiah got this decree to go forward to rebuild the city and the walls to the time that Christ died on the cross was exactly 483 years. So what that means is there's still 7 years remaining, and that 7 years has not happened yet. And you read this in Daniel 9, 24 through 27. It's very clear in there for folks. And so when Christ died on the cross, that stopped that clock, that prophetic clock for Israel. And we know that Israel from 30, let's just say 33 AD at the latest, when people believe Christ was crucified, to 70 AD, the Jews were basically operating in the land without God there, without God's blessing over the land. And if you saw my door open, it's not ghosts. I have dogs coming in and out.
I
You
saw
can't
that.
see
I
it, I
was
think.
like, I'm not gonna worry about it.
Yeah, no, it's the dogs coming in and out.
As long
Um,
as that demon didn't follow you home from the hotel you were at.
yeah, that was pretty crazy. But okay, so 70 AD, the Romans conquered Jerusalem. That was General Titus Vespasian. He had 4 legions with him. They came in, besieged the city, destroyed it, scattered the Jews. But there were still enough Jews in that area that they ended up doing another like 2 to 3 revolts. I think there was 3 revolts or wars in total against
Mm-hmm.
the Romans. And Josephus, who was a Jewish historian, he wrote about the Jewish wars, um, and his works are also copied by the Roman historians like Tacitus and Suetonius and others who corroborate his retelling of the story. So we know again in 70 AD the Jews were in control of Jerusalem. It was their city. They were conquered and destroyed by the Romans. And then a third time was in 135 AD by the Emperor Hadrian, the Roman Emperor Hadrian. This was the third revolt, and he was so tired of messing with the Jews and the uprisings and the riots and the protests and all that stuff that he completely wiped out the Jews in Jerusalem. He salted the ground that so nothing would grow, and he renamed the entire area Syria Palestina, and he renamed the city of Jerusalem Aelia Capitolina. And so that's where that name Palestina has seemed to stick for the last 2,000 years.
Yeah.
And Palestina was a Latin transliteration of the Hebrew Philistine. The Philistines were the enemies of Jerusalem forever. And so if you look at older maps prior to 130 BC or 130 AD, there's maps that go back to Herodotus and stuff. That area is called Palestina in different variations, but that's the land of the Philistines, and that's what that
Right.
means, right? And so from 130 on till roughly the 1500s, you had various people controlling Jerusalem. You had the Romans, you had the Byzantines, you had the Umayyad Caliphate, the Abbasids, I think they're called the Abbasids Caliphates, and all these different caliphates, these Muslim caliphates. You had the Crusaders from Europe that controlled the area for about 100 to 200 years. And then ultimately, the Ottoman Turks came in the 1500s and completely conquered almost all the Middle East. And that's who controlled it for the next 400 years until the end of World War One. It was all the land of the Ottoman Turks. And Palestine was just a name of a province. It wasn't a people. It wasn't a ethnicity. It was like Texas or California or Quebec, or so you think about a
Right.
province within a state or within a country. That's all it was, and nobody lived there. Mark Twain went there in I want to say 1867, I think, or 1861, and he came back and wrote a book about it called Innocents Abroad. And you can Google quotes from that. But he said there wasn't anybody in the land, and it was barren. He goes, that even the cactus wouldn't grow there. There wasn't any trees, no
Yeah.
people, no nothing.
Yeah. I've
And
seen
so,
that.
and and what's interesting is, as around 1897, Jews in Europe began what they call a Zionist movement, and this is their desire to kind of go back and reclaim their ancient homeland. And they saw the rising anti-Semitism in Europe even then in the 1890s, and said, "We got to get out of here, man. This is not safe for us anymore." And we've seen anti-Semitism throughout the last 2,000 years. It happened in England, it happened in
Right.
Spain, it happened in Russia, obviously happened in Germany in World War II. But everywhere they've gone, they've flourished, they've done well, and then the people around them kind of got angry at that and then decided to kick them out of the country or throw them in prison or kill them or whatever. So Jews have always kind of been these wandering, they call them the wandering Jews, for the
Mhm.
last 2,000 years. This whole time they've been in what they call the diaspora, of being scattered around the world without a country. So end of World War One, around 1917, the English and the French, and they're realizing that, hey, World War One's coming to an end. The Central Powers are going to lose. Germany, Austro-Hungary, the Ottoman Turks. They're going to lose, and we need to figure out how to divide up, at least with the Ottomans, how to divide up their kingdom
Yeah.
once we conquer them. So they came up in 1917. Lord Balfour, who was a British uh, politician or a diplomat of sorts,
Right.
um, put forth the Balfour Declaration, which allowed Jews to repatriate back to what was then called Palestine. Um, and so from 1920, and this was kind of reaffirmed in the San Remo Conference in 1920, but from 1920 to 1948, that whole area was called, or 1947, that was called the British Mandate. And the British controlled it, and they kind of uh, you weren't you weren't a Palestinian there. You were either a Palestinian Jew or you were a Palestinian Arab, but there wasn't any such thing as a Palestinian in and of itself. And if you go back and Google old newspapers prior to 1964, I believe, you can see that when the world, Europe, America, whoever, when they're talking about violence in the Middle East, in particular in what is now Israel, They
Hmm.
always call them the Arabs, or they call them the
Yeah.
Muslims. They're never called the Palestinians because both sides were called Palestinians at the time, or Palestinian Jews, Palestinian Arabs. They had a big newspaper at that time called the Palestinian or the Palestine Post, and they would uh, it was read by Jews and Arabs. Everybody, there's just the name that had been historically associated with that place from the Roman days, and so. Um, 1947, United Nations votes and approves the partitioning of a Jewish and an Arab state. And from 1947 till 1948, basically they were trying to figure out how to do this. 1948, May 14th, Israel declares their independence. President Truman is the first to approve, not approve. He's the first to recognize Israel as
Hmm.
its own new nation. And basically, it's been on game on since then. The Arabs have been trying to reclaim that land through mostly through military violence,
Yeah.
and they kept losing. They lost in 48, they lost in the 50s several times, they lost in the Six Day War in 1967. And so by the time of 1964, you have a young Egyptian named Yasser Arafat who came about that was, I guess, seeking to make his mark on the world. And he was wanting, I guess he came under the influence of the Soviets through some manner. This is in the middle of the Cold War. American influence is spreading here, Soviet influences, and everybody's competing through all these different proxy countries to kind of dominate those countries. Well, the Soviets influenced Yasser Arafat and said, "Hey, you're not going to win this war against the Jews. They're too well armed. They're too good of fighters, and they have the United States backing them. You got to win this war politically and through the um, public opinion." And so they
Right.
begin to propagandize this whole thing of Palestinian being its own kind of ethnic thing, and that is where the PLO was birthed, the Palestinian Liberation Organization.
Right.
And if you look at a map, and if you need to stop me at any point, let me know. But if you look at a
No, you're
map of the
good.
Middle East, you look at all of North Africa as Muslim. You look at all of Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Turkey. I mean, massive, massive parts of the world are Muslim.
Right.
Arab and Turks and Persians and different, Turkmens and different forms of Muslims. But they think that by dividing the land of Israel, which looks like a speck, it's like the size of New Jersey. Um, they think by dividing that they will bring peace
Yeah.
to all the Middle East, and that's just has been this big lie, right? And
Yeah.
so 1973 or 1967, the Jews attacked their enemies, the Jordanians, the Egyptians, and then other groups within there because they knew they were getting ready to attack them. So they did this preemptive strike and conquered the Sinai Peninsula. They reclaimed a lot of territory, more territory than they had previously to that, and they won it through military conquest, which, if you know, throughout history, anytime a country is defeated militarily, they lose that land. There's
Right.
never been any type of pressure to make the losing country get the land that they lost back. Nobody ever does that. So it
Yeah.
seems insane that this pressure has always been on Israel to keep giving up the land that they won fair and square. And they won it because they were attacked. In 1973, you had the Yom Kippur War. This was a surprise attack by the Arab neighbors around Israel to try and destroy her as a nation. And and this is where Golda Meir was the prime minister. She called Nixon, "Hey, if you don't help us, we're going to be done." Nixon sends over military aid support. They end up defeating their enemies by overwhelming odds. I mean,
Yeah.
the Jews versus all these Arab countries with these massive armies and air forces and so forth. And they end up getting like the Golan Heights, and every time they fought these wars, they keep getting more and more territory. And it's only been through this political pressure that they've been forced to give up land, like in Gaza. And so that happened in 2006, I believe. And
Yeah. I was
so,
going to say, wasn't it like 2005 or six that they
yeah,
were basically forced to give that land up for peace? And from
Yeah.
what I understand, I mean, they were literally dragging people out of their homes, out of their farms and things like that. And here they are now. All of a sudden, you've got no place to live, and people were just like moving into their stuff, taking over their
Yeah.
farms and things like that. They were just giving it up. And this false idea that if we give it up, we're going to be able to live at peace. But those people, they're not wanting to live at peace. That's
No.
not what it's about. It's never been about peace. It's never been about that land. It's always been about the destruction of the Jews.
And that incessant hatred
Yeah.
is satanic, and it's satanic for a reason, and we'll get into that in a minute. But it's also a blood rival that goes back to Abraham's
Ishmael,
sons
right?
and grandsons, Ishmael and
Yep.
Esau.
Yeah.
So there's been a long-standing feud between these, and Satan has been able to use this rivalry for millennia to try and destroy the Jews. Um, he tried it through the Egyptian Pharaoh. He tried it through the different warring tribes there when the Jews were on their exodus for 40 years. He's tried it through the Persians under Haman. I mean, so it's never not been an issue. It's always been an issue in this idea that began in 1977 with the Camp David Accords, this land for peace under of Jimmy Carter, is completely asinine. It's really looking at the problem very one dimensionally and thinking it's only about the land.
Yeah.
And as you said a second ago, it's never been about the land. It's been about wiping the Jews out as a people. And so, um, if I can finish this just in a minute or two,
Yeah.
I would just say this: that from 1977 to 2017 was 40 years that they tried this land for peace, and we've seen successive U.S. presidents and Congresses continue to kick the can down the road to recognize Jerusalem as the capital, the rightful capital of the nation of Israel, the only Jewish state in the world. And it was finally Donald Trump. Now, love him or hate him, I'm not here to defend him, but I will say that he was the first president to recognize Jerusalem as capital and move our embassy there. And so, in so doing, I think Satan is beginning to recognize the nearness of the hour when you add on things like these red heifers that are there
Mm.
and basically waiting to be sacrificed in the next Passover, which is I think April timeframe of this 2024.
Yeah.
They need those red heifers these pure red heifers based on the Mosaic law requirements in Leviticus, to be able to sacrifice them and then use their ashes to sanctify the priests, the tools, and all the different things to rebuild that third temple. And so I think Satan is stirring up Israel's enemies right now to prevent Israel from even getting close to rebuilding their third temple. And so, okay, so that kind of is the one over the world historical kind of perspective. There's never been a Palestinian ethnicity. Everybody that is currently in Gaza that is under the umbrella of being a Palestinian is either Egyptian, or they're Arab,
Yeah.
or they're Turk, or there's some actual ethnicity. There are not.
Right.
There's no such thing. There's never been a Palestinian kingdom, king. Uh, there's never been. I think, in fact, one of the or maybe one or two of the crusaders, European crusaders, back in the 11th or 12th century, claimed to be the king of Palestine or something, but he was like British or French or something. So, but there's no culture. They
Right.
speak Arabic. There's nothing different from them than somebody in Saudi Arabia or
Yeah.
somebody in Iraq or Jordan or anywhere else. So their flag is almost identical to the Jordanians. I think they would probably a subset of Jordanians,
Yes.
if you could even call it that. But the Jordanians are Arabs. They were founded by the King, what's his name, Fahd or whatever, back in the 40s. He planted his own people up there in Jordan for when it was called Transjordan, and basically they're a subset of Saudi Arabia. So there's this lie that the Palestinian are these indigenous people that are being beleaguered by Israel is a lie that they've been effectively using since the 1960s, since the PLO was first created, to kind of gain world sympathy. And every time Israel's acquiesced to this kind of pressure, they've been betrayed, and they've been betrayed with intifadas. They've had 2 or 3 intifadas, these violent uprisings where Palestinians were going in and doing suicide bombings and just walking up to Jews in the street and stabbing them and doing all kind of crazy stuff like that.
Right.
And that went on pretty much throughout the 90s and the early 2000s. And, in 2005 or six, whenever Israel gave Gaza up to the Palestinians, um, the Palestinians elected Hamas, and Hamas has never given up power. They've never had another election. I mean, they've just taken over, and they rule that area, that little strip of land, with an iron fist, and they use the people there for one purpose, and that is to attack Israel. They build tunnels with all the money they're given for humanitarian that were supposed to be for humanitarian purposes. They buy weapons. They build their headquarters underneath hospitals and schools. They put all of their significant military stuff within the civilian populace, because they know the Israel's doesn't really have the appetite to go and hit hospitals and churches and mosques and
Right.
things like that. Now, I know in the news here recently there was a hospital that was bombed. OSINT, which is like this open source intelligence that the Russians, everybody uses this, and there's video footage. This was a failed rocket attack from Islamic Jihad. You can see you can see the launch site, and you can see where the hospital is. It launches, and then it does this like U-turn, and it comes back
Yep.
and it
I know.
lands.
I
It like
saw it.
detonates.
Yeah, we
Crazy,
follow
crazy.
Amir and on Telegram, and we saw that he had posted the videos of this rocket launching and then turning in on itself back into hitting that hospital. And of course, the propaganda arm, of the entire world is, trying to turn the narrative and get the world to forget the literal slaughter, beheading of babies, raping of women,
Yeah.
all of this unbelievable stuff. We saw a video of a guy, one of their morgue directors, who was being asked about what he saw, and he started to talk about it, broke down, started crying, and walked out. He couldn't even talk about what he had seen and the bodies, how mutilated and mangled, I mean, cutting open a pregnant woman and killing her baby and then laying it next to her with the umbilical cord still attached to the mother and the baby. What kind of barbarism is this, that's all of a sudden we see this stuff, and yet the news cycle, we're so trained and people are little trained monkeys now, to where the news cycle lasts you and your emotional cycle lasts you a few minutes until the next news cycle hits, and they start, and you can see it start to turning. And I was talking to somebody, and I told him, I was like, when all this stuff was going on, I said, watch what happens. I said, now that Israel is on the offensive, they're going to turn this against Israel, because Jerusalem is a heavy stone. And every country on this planet eventually will try to come against Israel pretty much. It's going to be a complete slaughter at some point of the Jews. You think the Nazis were bad? You think this was bad? During that 7 years, during the tribulation, 2/3 of those people are going to be wiped out, or 3/4, correct? Anyway, 3/4,
Yeah.
2/3 are going to be slaughtered by the Antichrist. And, and this is what we're seeing now, is just leading up to all of that. Tell us, Pete, as you keep talking, tell us how we're getting there. Where are we going? Why is, I love what I believe you, Jan Markell, Tom Hughes, everybody says. People talk about, we're at the end of time. I mean, I saw a study recently where they were doing a poll, and it was like 60 to 70% of people were now saying, and we're not even talking about Christian people, we're talking about people just saying they believed that the end of humanity was close. I mean, we're talking about just regular people that, we're not talking about people that read the Bible or anything else, but people are really sensing things are coming to an end. And I think what we're here to say is, there is an end to this. So, and if Israel is the time clock and Jerusalem is the second hand, dude, this thing is happening quick, and Jesus is at the door. The world's burning, man. Where now? Tell us as where you were. Finish up and tell us. You don't have to finish. I'm not putting you under a time constraint, but tell us with what we're seeing now. Tie all this stuff together. Connect the dots for us.
So in the Bible, in Bible prophecy, there are basically three wars that are yet future that that have never happened in history but are slated to happen here in the future. Now the first one is what I believe to be a war, Psalm 83. And eschatologists and theologians are divided on whether it's simply a prayer or if it is actually a future prophecy. I think Bill Salas has been the one to champion this position that it is future prophecy. And I know Amir Sarfati thinks that this happened in 1948. I don't believe that. I think most people don't believe that. I think that's the minority position on that view. But I think what we're gonna see unfolding here is Psalm 83. So in Psalm 83, it lists these nations by their ancient tribal names, because back then they didn't have Jordanians, and they were called whatever their tribes were then. But it's these people groups that live in these areas, like in southern Jordan and central Jordan, etc., that would make up these groups that come against Israel to basically just try and destroy her. And so there's about I don't know, 7 or 8 nations listed, and what's interesting to me is that all of these folks fit under the banner of Palestinian. And I think you could probably find all these groups within Palestinian Gaza itself or the West Bank. And so what's interesting about what you're talking about earlier about this narrative, especially with this thing like this hospital getting hit with this missile, is that the Arabs that are using this for propaganda don't really care. I mean, they care about they want to try and shift influence in the West, in Europe, and America, and other places. But they are really using that to stir up anger in Arab populations and Arab-speaking countries and Muslim countries to rise up as this flood against Israel itself. And so I think I think right now that's working. You've got the Russia, United States, Britain, everybody that's seen the evidence that Israel's presented regarding this rocket hitting this hospital in Gaza. They're all on board now saying, yep, it was a failed rocket attempt. And it's not, they're not just in an echo chamber. They're actually looking at the evidence saying, yeah, that's what happened. I mean, that's what happened. I mean, you can't reshape reality when the evidence is hitting you in the face right there. But most of the Arab world don't know that, and they don't care. They're just reading Arab-speaking news, Al Jazeera, and all these other ones, and they're getting one perspective, and they're making it look like Israel attacked this hospital on purpose, killed, and the numbers wildly fluctuate between 500 and 1,000 and more. But you're seeing them use that to stir up the hornet's nest in the Arab world to get these people to rise up. So I think we're going to see the rise of unrest and conflict in West Bank. We're already seeing it in the northern border in the Golan Heights against Lebanon with Hezbollah. There's other groups within Syria that are being mobilized. You've got the Taliban in Afghanistan, of all places, saying, hey, if you'll give us safe passage through your countries, we'll go march and fight against the Jews. And so this is this big conflict that I see stirring up right now. I think we're watching it happen. And some interesting things will come out of this. One is that I think it will really test Israel and even the allies. There's who knows how many sleeper cells here in America, but ultimately Israel will win and her borders will expand even further. and she will become enlarged in terms of a nation. And then secondly, I think that she'll destroy Damascus as a whether it's preemptive or whether it's a retaliation for something that Syria does, Bashar Assad. And we know underneath Damascus, that's where he stores all of his chemicals and all the bad stuff. And so Isaiah
Now you're
17 says that
referencing a
Damascus,
prophecy, and I
yeah,
apologize, Pete. Not
no,
there's like a delay or something but you're referencing the destruction of Damascus. You're referencing a prophecy in Scripture, correct?
yeah, Isaiah 17 talks about the destruction of Damascus, taken away from being in a city forever,
In one
and
night.
the in one night. And
Yeah,
Damascus is the oldest inhabited city in the world, continually inhabited city in the world. It's older.
yeah,
It's the oldest. It's always had somebody living in it since
right.
the days of Abraham and before. So it's going to be completely removed from being a city, and nobody will ever live there again. So that speaks to me as either being some type of a nuclear attack or a kind of Moab, mother of all bombs kind of attack, but it triggers all of the chemical weapons and all the things underneath Damascus that
Yeah.
make it uninhabitable. And so those are the two immediate things I see happening in the next, I don't know, between now and say 3 or 4 months. But then what that does is I think that sets the stage. What also during this time, I think Israel will take out Iran's nuclear capabilities, or at least some kind of an allied U.S., Jewish, or Israeli, European kind of front that goes in and wipes out Iran's nuclear capabilities. And that sets the stage for Ezekiel 38, 39. So
Hmm.
the interesting thing is in the Psalm 83 conflict, you have Israel here. I'm trying to find a little thumb drive or something, but you have Israel. Let's just say that this is Israel, right? And this is the Middle East writ large.
Yeah,
And all of the neighbors around Israel are these ones that are in Psalm 83. Now, Ezekiel 38 and 39 are none of those neighbors. These are not
right.
even a factor anymore. So the ones that attack her in Ezekiel 38 and 39 is going to be basically a coalition of Russia. Um, Most scholars think Turkey and Iran, or what used to be Persia, and they have with them this huge army that comes also from all the former Soviet satellite Soviet countries like Kyrgyzstan, uh, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, all of those stand countries,
Right.
plus a contingent that comes from Africa, from Libya and Sudan. All of the Muslims come up from that direction as well, and they march against Israel. Well, the interesting thing is in Psalm 83, it doesn't mention U.S. or allies coming to Israel's aid, but we're watching it happen right now. But it doesn't say they don't help either, right? But in
Right.
Ezekiel 38, it's very clear that nobody comes to her aid. Even her political allies or people that she's friendly with, like Saudi Arabia, who in Ezekiel 38 is called Sheba and Dedan, which is their ancient name. They protest, but they don't get involved. They're like, I don't want anything to do with that. It is
Pete, can
such a
I ask you
massive army.
something? And
Sure.
again, I am so sorry. Matter of
Okay.
fact, by the way, um, because we're on some sort of delay here, when I try to ask you to, or when I try to say something, unfortunately, every time it like interrupts you, and you're what I tell you, I told you not long ago, the Garciaites, man, they rip me hard for you need to quit interrupting Pete Garcia. I'm like, you don't understand. It's on a delay. I'm not trying to interrupt him. I just want to ask a question because I'm trying
It's
to
okay.
make sure that we clarify. Not that it's not clear, but it's clear in my head. But so, do you think that in scenario wise, or it's plausible that the reason that people don't come to their aid at that point could be because of the complete destruction? Let's say they nuke Damascus. They're at a point where they're threatened so badly that they hit Damascus, let's say with a nuke or something like that, or they're being accused of that. And it just a huge loss of life, all of that stuff. Do you think that could be why nobody comes to their aid at that point? And Russia, Israel, or Russia, Turkey, Iran, all of them are like, okay, this nonsense has to stop, and then they bring down their little coalition to wipe that out. Do you think is that plausible?
That's plausible. I think what I guess my preferred or favored theory on why nobody comes to her aid is that the West is in disarray. I think the rapture of the church is the catalyst that kind of triggers the collapse of, call it Western civilization. And that's why not only are they not coming to her aid, because of for political reasons, but they can't,
Yeah.
and
So
look at where
that's
the
what I
United
was
States is.
getting to was the
Yeah.
fact that you believe, I do too, by the way, you believe that the rapture happens, Gog and Magog war, Ezekiel 38, that you believe that happens after the rapture.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I,
Yeah.
I,
And the
I believe that too. I
and,
mean, I believe it's after the rapture. But I was just still wondering if that could still be a scenario why, that's part of that explanation, just out of curiosity. Yeah.
it, I think I mean, it's definitely plausible, but given the really the vitriol that's risen up against Russia by the United States and Europe since the Ukraine conflict started, I just don't see the U.S. not getting involved if Russia gets involved and leads this huge coalition. I think that we don't get
Oh,
involved because
yeah.
we can't.
Yeah.
But even right now, you've got the Soviet or not the Soviet, the Russians kind of aligning with Hamas, and presumably gave them training in the ability to do the attacks that they did,
Right.
with the drones and with the dropping bombs from drones and jamming and all the other stuff, hacking and everything they're doing. But it seems like the United States is we've given so much aid and weapons to Ukraine. We left 900 billion in military equipment in Afghanistan. I mean, we're just bleeding stuff faster than we can make it, and it just seems like, irrespective of uh, of the rapture,
Right.
the United States is not even in a position to do anything anyways at this point. If China decides to take Taiwan tomorrow, we
No,
can't do anything about it.
no, they're going to
Um,
take it and they won't do anything about it.
but I guess my favorite thing is theory is that the rapture, when it happens, if it takes, say, 10% of the American population out, we're suddenly gone.
Yeah.
You remove, I think we're at 320 million Americans right now. If you remove 10% of that, 32 million instantly gone, that aren't working, they aren't paying taxes, they aren't showing,
Yeah.
they're nothing. You got to think about all the implications that would have, plus all of the chaos that would cause in every major urban center and everywhere in the United States. That we would collapse. I mean, we're already teetering on the edge right now as it is,
Yeah.
without something like the rapture happening, but that would just push us over the edge. And the US, the world right now is so tied in with the US economy in terms of financial, the stock markets, all the trading, corporations, all of that transnational stuff that goes on in the world. The US has got its fingers in everything. So if we collapse, we're going to drag down every other industrialized nation with us pretty quickly. And I think that's what causes nobody to come to her aid in Ezekiel 38. Now, also, God in Ezekiel 38, now, mind you, the church was a mystery in the Old Testament. They didn't know what it was. It
Right.
wasn't, they didn't understand what the church was. Even Jesus' disciples didn't understand what the church was until towards the end. And he's beginning to explain these things. And we start to see the birth of the church, or the beginnings of the church there in Acts, book of Acts. But uh, Ezekiel 38, 39, God's focus shifts completely to Israel, and it's only about the nation of Israel. So Ezekiel lived in the 6th century BC. He's a captive in Babylon at the time. Daniel's up here. He's like way up in the government, high up.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Ezekiel's just some prophet out here in the middle of the slave camps and stuff. Like but he's prophesying about something that's going to happen like 2,600 years into the future, and from God's perspective, there's no mention of anything like the church, or there's no anything.
Right.
God's calling them my people, etc. It seems like the church is not in the view either. So that war is so overwhelming, and it catches Israel again by surprise, and God supernaturally destroys all of their enemies in a way that defies science, defies modern military strategy, it defies everything. And so God wins that war for them. And I think in that process of that war, that conflict, there's a major earthquake. I think in that process, the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock are both completely turned into fine powder. They crumble. They could get destroyed now. I think that Hamas and Islamic Jihad don't want to shoot missiles towards Jerusalem because they're afraid of hitting those mosques. They almost
Right.
did the other day. But it could either get destroyed there or in this earthquake in Ezekiel 38, 39.
Yeah.
And I think that is the last thing holding the Jews back from rebuilding the third temple. There won't be any more hesitation to build that third temple at that point. And lastly, the what both the Psalm 83, Isaiah 17, and Ezekiel 38 wars does in the big picture view of the world is it completely neuters Islam as a militant force in the world. Islam will no longer be militant. It won't even be dogmatic. I mean,
Right.
so many Muslim men are going to die in these conflicts, unfortunately, because Christ died for them too. But
Yeah.
they, God said, hey, they're going to do this. They're going to fight this fight, and I'm going to destroy them. Um, and it's going to completely neuter Islam as a militant religion going forward. So that in the final 7 years, that last week of years in Daniel's 70th week, that's still future, the world comes together at first under this it's called the Whore of Babylon. And it's a religion that's basically made up of all religions. Everybody's like, hey, there's no right way, there's no wrong way. We all go to heaven. And, it's kind of that very
Mm-hmm.
ecumenical until the midpoint when the Antichrist takes over and demands that everybody worship him as God, just like the Roman emperors used to do back in, from Domitian on.
Yeah.
So uh, that's how I see things kind of playing out. I think things will only escalate between now and the rapture. So there is going to be rising violence, rising earthquakes, rising natural disasters, and so forth. Like the birth pangs, they keep increasing, and they don't get less and less. They become more and more and stronger and stronger.
Yeah.
So that's what I see playing out.
So let me summarize what you said. So what we're saying is, and I said earlier, you, Jan, Markel, Tom, all you guys always say, what did you think the last days were going to look like? I mean, why are we surprised? And people, you hear people complain, you hear people frightened, scared, living in fear. And I'm like, dude, we are living in the most biblically prophetic times ever. I mean, as far as people say, you hear people say, oh, well, we don't see God move like we used to, or we don't. And I'm like, man, you're seeing it. You're seeing it now. I mean, we've never had a time in history where Russia, Iran, and Turkey were all in league together. Iran used to be Israel's best friend in the early 70s, correct?
Yeah. And
Turkey, the Jews used to vacation there. And Russia, was never just that much of a political, you know, enemy anyway, always sort of neutral for the most part. Well, I should say off and on, but we've never seen those three countries ready to go, just like we know that will happen in Ezekiel 38. So, You're saying from here, you don't believe this thing is going to get better with Israel. You just think it's going to get worse, according to scripture.
Yes.
Would that be fair?
Yeah. No, I think that's fair. I think things are going to continue to escalate until they reach a culmination point with Israel ultimately destroying Damascus. And that's
Yeah.
a bold statement. I mean, this is how I see things playing out. But we know that Jesus said that and we can even look back. I did a presentation in Oklahoma on the vanishing point, and I have the chart, and I start at the year 1900, and I have it broken up into different categories. You have crisis, world government, world finance, so forth, all the way to Israel. And I said, we started at the year 1900, and then we end up in the time of Revelation 13. What does that world look like? And I go step by step through the decades, and I show you how we've been frog marched essentially to get from there to where we are today with digital currency, the biometric technology that ultimately will embed technology into the right hand or the forehead, becoming the mark of the beast. We don't know exactly what that's going to look like just yet, but we're seeing the convergence of everything the Bible talks about all happening faster and faster and faster. And you can look at the world from say 1900 to 1948. There were some pretty big events that happened: World War I, World War II, the Great Depression, so forth. But from 1948, things have just exponentially continued to rise, especially with technology, world population numbers, and so on and so forth. I mean,
Yeah.
1900, the year 1900, the world was we started out at 2 billion people, and now we're at 8 billion people. And we started out at the beginning of the 1900s with uh, somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe 30 to 40 countries. Most of those were empires that other countries fell under. And then after the World War II ended and colonialism came to its end, all of these countries began to spring up out of these old British Empire, French Empire, and now we're up to like 193, 194 nations.
Right.
Um, that everybody's got their own agendas, everybody's moving along and doing all these different things, and it's everything is just exponentially been racing faster and faster. And there is a sense of the frog in the pot. The frog gets in you cook a frog, put them in water, warm
Right.
water, lukewarm water, and you don't put them in boiling hot water because they'll jump out. You put them in the warm water and they'll stay there, and you slowly turn the heat up, and eventually they get so hot they don't even realize that the water's getting hotter and hotter until it's too late, until they're boiling at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're cooking frogs, right? Eating frog legs. I think we're in that state now where we've been in this. It's been so incremental and for so long, and we have these short jaunts of like where exponential growth and things happen, and then it goes back to this incremental, and people kind of get lulled into this normalcy bias, where they don't think something like um, what happened on the 7th of October in Israel. They don't think anything like that could happen again because it'd been what 50 years since Yom Kippur to the
Right.
day,
Yeah.
and but then it happens. Nobody thought 9/11 would happen, but then it happened, and then after that, things just kind of go fast and start snowballing, and it just man, it's before you know it, 10 years have passed, and so much has changed. And I look back. I mean, I retired in 2020, and I look back now at 2020, and I think, man, it feels like forever ago,
Yeah.
but it's only been like 3 years.
Yeah.
I look back to when I was in Iraq in 2005, 2006, and that feels like a lifetime ago. So much happens between now and then. But one kind of thing about there's 2 points really, if you have time.
Yeah. Go ahead.
When I mentioned earlier about Genesis 12, in the 12:3, where God tells Abram that I will bless those who bless you and I will curse those who curse you. There's a guy named Bill Koenig who was a Washington correspondent for
Yes.
decades, lived in DC for a long time, was always reporting at the White House and other places. He put out a book back in the early 2000s called Eye to Eye, and it's been updated since because obviously things keep happening. But he said that he shows the correlation between Israel, us betraying Israel or us double dealing with Israel, and natural disasters that happen. So right when we gave or forced Israel under President Bush, we forced Israel to give up Gaza to um, the Arabs there. Uh, we got hit with Hurricane Katrina, like the costliest, deadliest natural disaster we'd had
Yep.
to date. I don't think anything exceeded that for the United States. So, and every time we do something against Israel, something happens here. So while I am encouraged by the current administration's support right now of Israel, as you mentioned earlier, as the ground defensive begins, you're going to see world opinion begin to shift, and everybody's going to be calling for a ceasefire and this, that, and the other. And Israel cannot afford to do a ceasefire. They have to completely eradicate Hamas as a organization, and probably have to wipe out Islamic Jihad and potentially Hezbollah as well, to remove these threats that they've been living under for decades. So if we ever get to that point where we don't support them, I see bad things happening to the United States in the form
Yes.
of natural disasters, financial disasters, and things that basically weaken us. But for the most part, you're right. Most churches aren't talking about this. Christians, for the most part, are I don't want to say ignorant of it, but they're pretty much indifferent to it. It's just kind of
Yeah.
par for the course for the Middle East, and not recognizing that Israel is God's timepiece. And the reason they don't recognize this as God's timepiece is because they've grown up under these really bad eschatologies like amillennialism, postmillennialism, post-tribulationism, pre-wrath. All of those things uh, are faulty, and they are not biblical, and they have confused Christians for millennia. And at this point, there's a growing number of Christians who don't support Israel anymore. So there used to
Right.
be really high support for it. But the Generation X, are we Generation X, or the new Generation Z? Is that who it is?
I think this one is X, right? Because it's Z. Was Z? We're at, yeah, X. The new one is X.
Okay, so these folks have largely grown up in a time when uh, Israel has they've lived under the age of when Israel's been the object of propaganda for so long now.
Yeah.
That's why you see protests all over the United States, London, Australia, Harvard. Um, just in Australia, they were saying gas the Jews. I mean, you've got
No, I
people in
know.
New York carrying Muslims carrying swastikas around. Like it is mind-boggling to think that this propaganda campaign since the 60s has been very effective. And it's been very effective because Satan has been championing this. If he can, the reason Satan is so anti-Semitic, and the reason he needs to destroy the Jews, is because if he can destroy them as a people and remove them from their land, Bible prophecy can't happen. And then that means that
Right.
Bible prophecy is broken. God lied, and he's bought himself some more time, or figured out some way to avoid his fate in the lake of fire. So that's why ultimately he's doing all this. Why the Jews? Why are they the most hated people on the planet? Why not the Armenians or the Japanese or the Turks or the South Africans or the whoever, Nigerians or the Brazilians? Like why is it that one group, and why is it throughout history it's been that one group? And when you read the Bible and you read 1 John 5, I believe verse 19, 18 or 19, says that Satan is currently running this world,
Yeah.
and he knows Bible prophecy as well, and he does not want the Jews to rebuild their third temple. He does not want them to be in the land. He wants them out. He wants them dead. He tried it through Hitler. He tried it through all these different world leaders, and now he's using Islam. But once Islam runs its course and is defeated in these three wars that I mentioned, or these three conflicts,
Hmm.
Psalm 83, Isaiah 17, and Ezekiel 38, Islam, in terms of its usefulness, will have been done with. I mean, they're done. They're worn out. Satan will shift to his final world religion, which is this ecumenical, the Whore of Babylon thing, and
Right.
ultimately that will lead to worshiping the Antichrist, the mark of the beast, and all that.
Mm.
It's a
So
lot.
yeah, it is. So we believe that probably the next thing to happen is probably the destruction of Damascus.
Well, I think what we'll see next is hold on, I'm looking for a quote here,
No, go
and
ahead.
I think what we'll see here is we're going to
So
start.
you think we're in the beginnings of the Psalm 83 war?
Yeah, yeah, I think
And
we're going to
then
see the
sometime
escalation.
within that is going to be the destruction of Damascus. By the way, Israel just threatened to destroy Damascus not long ago.
Yeah, yeah, because they know
Yeah,
what's under there,
yeah,
and they know Bashar Assad gets involved. But this is why this thing with this hospital is so this rocket that hit this hospital is so significant for Hamas. It's not that anybody died there. It's not even that the Jews launched it against this hospital. We know that evidence shows that Islamic Jihad launched it. It misfired, whatever. It came back and landed back on them.
right,
What is significant is for their ability to propagandize this event and make it and use it to stir up anger and this violent sentiment in the Arab world to rise up
right.
against Israel because they think now is the time. Um, and so I know a lot of theologians are coming out. They're very cautious on whether or not to call this Psalm 83. And I'm not saying dogmatically that it is. I just think it is. It seems to me like it
Yeah,
it, it meets all of those, checks those blocks, and
yeah,
not only checks the blocks, but it serves the purpose that we see going forward. If we're as close to the end as we think we are, then Psalm 83 is going to happen at some point. Why
yeah,
not now? I mean, what?
yeah.
And this is the first time in 50 years they've had this Israel's declared war, and the attacks are so horrific. This is not something the Israelis are going to let go because they can't afford
No,
to. They're not even equating this to the Yom Kippur War. They're equating this back to the Holocaust as far as the level of atrocities that were committed.
right.
And they chased the Nazis down for decades after
Yeah.
World War II. Eichmann and all these guys that
Mm-hmm.
were hiding out in South America.
Yeah.
This is why I don't let my dogs in the office. I just Anyways, this is the Jews chased the Nazis for decades. They are not going to let this lie. I would
Yeah.
not be surprised if they don't take out the Hamas leadership in Qatar, if they don't take out Iranian capabilities in the region as well as in Iran itself. But for people that don't think that it's going to happen, I want to read a quote here, and I love this quote. I've used it in numerous articles, and it's so resonated with me that I can't think of anything better to describe what we're going to start seeing. The guy that wrote this article was, I believe, a Russian. His name was Anatoly Kaletsky, and it was talking about the Ukraine conflict in 2014, um, and how that was going to escalate into more conflict, right?
Mm-hmm.
He writes, it may seem impossible, and he's talking about World War One as an example, because it was right at the coming up on the 100 year, it was the 100 year anniversary of the start of World War One. He says, it may seem impossible that Washington would go to war against Beijing to defend some uninhabited Japanese islands or against Moscow over some decrepit mining town in Donbass if Ukraine ever joined NATO. But in early 1914, though it seemed almost impossible that Britain and France would go to war with Germany to defend Russia against Austria-Hungary over a dispute with Serbia, yet
Mm.
by June 28, war moved straight from impossible to inevitable without ever passing through improbable. 4 years later, 10 million people had died. So when you think about how quick World War One began, and the impossible scenario that was laid out, nobody believed that that could ever happen.
Yeah.
And there was a book that came out in 1912 and 1913, and it was really popular in 1913 called The Great Illusion, talking about that war was done. The world was done with war as the
Mm-hmm.
world becomes, because they're in the second industrial revolution. Everybody was trading with everybody. People were
Yeah.
able to mass produce things. And it just seemed like capitalism would completely end war forever. And by 1914, that next summer, the world was at war again. So his thing from impossible to inevitable without ever going through improbable is something that I would probably have tattooed on my chest or, something put on everything I could put on because the impossible seems to happen. And as
Yes.
improbable as it seems, or as impossible as it seems, it just goes from impossible to inevitable, and it just happens, and the world is thrust into this chaos, and then we sit back, we're watching the world on fire, burning, and just the craziness happening, and we're like, what is going on? And I think the only real true source of not history, it does have history, but the truth and what's going to happen isn't laid out in the pages of the Bible. And that's because God doesn't exist in time. He sees all of time all at the same time. Much in the same way that if you and I were on a street watching a parade go by, we're just watching what happens in front of us because we're packed in with all the people and we can't move, and we're
Mm-hmm.
watching the parade go by. God is that guy in the helicopter, Channel 5 News, that can see the end and the beginning of the parade at the same time, all at once, and everything in between. And so
Yeah.
he sees history. He sees the end of the world at the beginning, and he says so in Isaiah 46:9 and 10. And so not only does he see it, he declares this is going to happen. So
Yeah.
I believe these wars will happen exactly like the Bible plays out or says. And I think the rapture, there's some other things going to be thrown in there that will surprise people, especially Christians that don't believe in the rapture.
Yeah.
I believe some Christians are going to be caught going up feet first. And there's going to be a shock when they hear the trumpet sound. And,
Man.
I don't think I've ever told you this story, but in 2011, I think it was 2011, I was stationed at Fort Bliss, El Paso, and as on every military base in the world, there is a revelry, and then there is retreat. So they play the
Mm-hmm.
horn in the morning at usually like 6:30, and it's real fast. It's like 15, 20 seconds. And then retreat at the end is very long, but it starts off with this trumpet blast. Dun, 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 dun. And then I was at we call them PXs, the shopettes that
Yep.
they're like little gas stations you can go in. I was
Mm-hmm.
going in to buy something, and I had gotten off work late, and I didn't realize the time. I had lost track of time, and I was walking into the shopette, and it's El Paso, high desert, all that. And I didn't notice that I was walking under this light that had a speaker attached to it that blasted out this retreat and revelry, and it blasted this trumpet sound, and I could have swore that was a rapture at that moment. Man, I was like smiling. I was like, and then I was like, oh crap, it's rare. I got to stand here in the heat and still do all
Then
this.
the
So
disappointment set in.
yeah,
Oh,
there was like a
look,
split second I thought it was the rapture. So
I'm telling you,
um,
man, when that thing blows, if I'm still alive, when that thing blows, I'm just saying, I'm one of those Christians. I'm looking for the rapture. I mean, I'm like, okay, Jesus, let's rock and roll, man. Let's get this out of here. The only thing is my heart. I'm a father and I have two kids. One claims to not be saved, and then one says he is, but no fruit or anything. But um, you know, so that pray and talk to him as much as I can. But man, I'm telling you, even then, when that trumpet goes, man, I still think no matter who you are, how much you're looking for the Lord, I still think you're going to be like, what? Your hair is going to be like, you're going to be going up at Mach whatever with your hair on fire. So, I mean, the whole thing, this is going to happen. Jesus lit the match back then, and gas has been poured on incrementally over the last 2,000 years, little by little. But man, it literally to me seems like the gas is just being dumped on this world by buckets now, and it's all coming to an end. I mean, I'm not saying it's coming to an end tomorrow. What I am saying is in the grand scheme of time, we're at the end, man. I mean, we're right there. I think it happens. In my opinion, this happens in our lifetime.
Yeah, I would be surprised if it goes beyond 10 years. I mean, I'm
I
of the mindset
I would say
that
to me, 20, if we get past 2030, I'll be surprised. That's my
yeah. And,
opinion.
well, there's things there is aside from the religious or biblical implications about the time, all of the correlations with patterns and typology in the Bible that seem to signal that we're at the end here. Um, there are things happening in the world that will completely upend the world by 2030. For
Yeah,
one, is our national debt. We're
right.
at 33 trillion. That's not sustainable. I mean, it's not going to go on for much longer that way. Something will have to give. China will be completely upended by 2030 in terms of their economy. Their economy is think I heard a really good podcast on this a while back, and the guy was discussing wealth and how wealth is generated in the world. And you think about the average Western nation like the United Kingdom or America or someplace, it takes generations to invent things. You've got to go through the wickets of inventing the Model T, and then from the Model T, you go to the next car. You add on little bits here and
Right.
there, and you learn through trial and error how to progress technologically, or to progress financial systems, or to progress economic systems, and so on and so forth. It requires infrastructure, and you have a country like China that built this in basically a generation, one generation. They
Yeah.
don't have the depth to sustain it. And as the United States begins to falter financially, and China is already a giant paper tiger when it comes to their economy, most of it's a big shell game. They've got
Yeah.
some really massive financial problems that they're trying to figure out, um, which is why Taiwan is such a big deal for them, because Taiwan is like the number one computer chip maker in the world. So that's they have to take Taiwan, and we don't know exactly when that'll be. That may be in the next year as well, because they want to do it. If they fear Trump's coming back into power or into office, they're going to want to take it before Trump comes back.
Right.
But China is in a huge problems. Not only that, but their population is starting to collapse. They had a two-child policy for a long time, then they went to a one-child policy for a long time. And not only is there a huge uh, gender disparity between male and female there, but generationally speaking, by 2050, most of their population, like 60 to 70 to 80% of their population, is going to be geriatric,
Mm.
and not working and not producing. So between now and 2050, they're declining very rapidly. And so when nations get into that position, same with Russia, who's a fraction of the population, but their population is really in a bad place. They become
Right.
very dangerous. It's like a cornered animal is dangerous,
Yeah.
and you'll start to see unrest happening in the world. And I think that all kind of aligns with where the Bible says we were going to be, anyways. So aside from biblical prophecy, the world is changing very rapidly. The Great Reset, if that does come to fruition, that's going to upend the current world order. The world order we live in right now is the United States is on top. We basically dominate everything financially, politically, economically, and so forth, militarily. And the Great Reset says that we won't. That every nation is going to be kind of on equal footing, which means that
Right.
everything has to be redistributed. So that means that the United States has got to remove its sovereignty through some way or means. Now, the other thing I wanted to make out or point out was that I'm starting to see a lot of conservative, Republican pundits that are poo-pooing this idea of supporting Israel, and they're looking at it from the lens, the skeptical lens of that, we're only doing this because the deep state, the Biden administration, the progressives, and one worlders, and political left all want to push us into World War III in order to uh, shut down the next elections,
Yeah.
prevent the next elections, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of conspiracy theory on that side, on the conservative side, that is, I think, confusing a lot of people in the middle. And I can definitively say that it will not lead to World War III. There is no World War III in the Bible except for Armageddon, and that doesn't
Right.
happen until the very, very end, at the end of the tribulation. And so we're going to see unrest in the Middle East. We're going to see, I think, Psalm 83, Isaiah 17, and play out. I think the rapture takes place. Then that leads to Ezekiel 38. When the end of that leads to basically this covenant that's confirmed that starts the clock for that last 7 years. And that's how I see things playing out. But the conservative side, there's a lot of folks that I used to listen to. I say used to, but because they've kind of turned their back on Israel right now.
Yeah.
I might agree with them on 99% of everything else,
Yeah.
but on this issue, this is a defining issue, and it basically is starting to split the wheat from the chaff. The Christians, the
Yep.
true born again Bible believing Christians who understand their Bibles and understand Genesis 12:3 is still in effect,
Yeah.
from nominal Christians, lukewarm Christians, people that don't care about Israel, that they're just whatever, they're just culturally Christian, but they're not,
Yeah.
true believers. I think it's starting to separate us from that. So that's that division, that when Christ said, he in Matthew 10, I didn't come to bring peace, I came to bring a sword.
Yep.
The truth is going to start dividing people. And same thing with the fire. The fire is going to divide people
Yeah.
from with even within families, within structures. And as you mentioned, your children, I have family members that aren't saved and that are,
Yeah.
vehemently leftist, and this is one of those things. They look at me like I'm crazy, like I've lost all my marbles. I look at them as like, man, I don't want to be you when
Yeah.
that day comes, because it's coming, and you
Yep.
could pray for them. And hopefully all of this talking about what's happening and all of this that we're discussing, when it does happen, when these things start to happen, that people will start to believe. And just like Jesus said on the road to Emmaus, he's telling these disciples after his resurrection, they didn't even recognize him. He was able to change it the way he looks. And so
Yeah.
he's like, why are you guys so sad? And these guys are walking away from Jerusalem, going to, I forget where they were going to, what town they were going to, but uh, he says, what's going on? Why are you guys so sad? And they're like, dude, where you been?
Yeah. I know.
our Messiah was killed, like, where you been, living under a rock or something? And so he
Mm.
says, from that moment on, Jesus began to explain from the Old Testament all of the scripture pointing to him. And then when they get to the house, he breaks bread with them. They see him for who he is, and he disappears, right? So he's telling these disciples things ahead of time so that when it happens, they would believe. And he says that.
Right.
So we're telling people today in this podcast and others in writings and everything else, that as these things begin to play out, the Bible is absolutely coming true and is fulfilling everything it said it did thousands of years ago.
He, for those of you who want to go, and I encourage you to go and read this for yourself, give us three passages of scripture where people can go and read for themselves what about, let's say, Damascus and Psalm 83 or Isaiah 17, right? Is Damascus. Psalm 83 is a war. Now, full disclosure, I was always taught and always believed that was an imprecatory prayer.
Yeah.
Even up until recently, I kept saying I still think that's an imprecatory prayer written by Asaph. But as you're watching everything unfold, I'm not so sure anymore. I don't think you can be dogmatic one way or another, because everything seems to be unfolding. And it's like, you know what? I love what Daniel's like, oh, Lord, tell us what's going to happen, or tell me what's going to happen. And God said, Daniel, close it up. It's not for you to know, but those at the time of the end, it will be revealed to them. They'll know what's going on. And we can look at that and go, oh, well, I didn't try to be dogmatic about something, but as things unfold, we're going, oh, that's what's going on. I
Yeah,
think
I
that's
was
a
I
fair
was
way to
pretty
look at it.
I mean, I was pretty agnostic about Psalm 83 either way. I was never dogmatic one way or the other on
Yeah.
whether it was a war or a prayer. But when this happened this weekend, it just struck me. I was like,
I
this
Me
seems like it.
too.
It smells like it. Looks like it. Um, Bill Salus
I
is over there smirking, like I told you guys.
I know. Well, the funny thing is every time I would see Bill Salas on, I'm like, and the funny thing is when we were in Israel with Tom Hughes last year, we had a talk about that, about the Psalm 83. And I told him, I was like, I still think it's a prayer, man. I still think it's a prayer. And now I'm like eating my words because now I'm like looking at it and I'm like, I mean, of course, I was never ready to, you know, bet a paycheck on it or anything like that. But I just kept it just, I was like, is Bill just making something out of this? I mean, but now I'm
Yeah,
looking at it, I'm like, Bill may be the smartest guy in the room, I mean, it's
yeah.
I don't know, man. I just really I see all this and I agree with you. It's not going to stop. I think the match has been lit and now everything really is kicking quick. I heard an old saying, let's kick this pig. And I think that's what happened October 7th.
Yeah, and it's if I were to point people to any particular passages just to help them kind of understand it. So obviously Psalm 83 is in the book of Psalm. The Isaiah 17, he's an Old Testament prophet. And that would be in the 17th chapter, speaks specifically about the eternal destruction of Damascus. And as I mentioned earlier, it's always been a city going back to the days
Yeah.
of Abraham. So that has never happened yet. So it's still future. Ezekiel 38, 39. What's interesting and fascinating about Ezekiel's prophecies is that you see them in order of the events. So Ezekiel 36, it's talking about kind of the rebirth of Israel. Ezekiel 37 is the dry bones, the valley of dry bones, speaking of the national resurrection of the nation of Israel together again in the last days.
Yeah.
Ezekiel 38 and 39 are after that, and it speaks of this major coalition that I mentioned earlier that comes against Israel. And then after that, you look at the what's happens at the end of the second coming, or after the second coming, the millennial age. It talks about the rebuilding of this third temple, and so that's where the Jews are getting they've been able to rebuild a model to scale of what based off of those dimensions given in there, what this temple is going to look like. And that temple is different from the one that Herod had built and finished by the time of Jesus' day,
Yeah.
and the one that Solomon had built back in the early 900s. So I think that this marks. I think I misspoke earlier. I said that Israel was divided in 970. I think Israel was divided in 930 when
Okay.
Solomon died. I think he ruled for 40 years. His father had ruled for 40 years. So, but so there's this temple, and they're all in order. So all these chapters are in order. So if you start in Ezekiel 36 and 37, just keep reading, and you'll start to see how these are the major events that are going to play out. Insert in there Psalm 83, insert in there Isaiah 17, insert in there the rapture of the church, because the rapture is going to remove the church. The church wasn't in the first 69 weeks of Daniel's 70 weeks, and we're not going
Yeah.
to be in the 70th. We don't have any time or place. They can also go to Jeremiah 30, 7 through 11, I believe. It talks about the time of Jacob's trouble and how during the tribulation, God is going to destroy all the nations of the world, but he's going to discipline Israel through that. And that's mentioned in Zechariah chapter 13, verse 8, where 2/3 of the Jews are going to die going into the tribulation. And maybe that's why they don't like Bible prophecy. Most of them
Yeah.
don't
Right.
read it or know it.
Yeah.
We know at the Holocaust, 1/3 of the Jews were killed, and they came back and rebounded as a nation and as a people. Now they're up. I think they're north of 7 million in the world, Jews in the world. And that doesn't even count all the Sephardic and Ashkenazi and all the different Jews that have kind of intermarried throughout the ages,
Right.
people that have Jewish bloodlines. But um, you could go to Matthew 24. So Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21 are all the same, the Olivet Discourse. They're
Right.
told from slightly different perspectives. I think Luke does a different perspective than Matthew does, but they basically capture all the main things.
Yeah.
But in Luke, it says that that the Gentiles are going to trample Jerusalem until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Well, that didn't make any sense really until 1948 because there wasn't a Jewish nation,
Yeah.
and the Jews didn't control Jerusalem. It had just been Gentile for millennia at that point.
Yep.
So now that the Jews are back, now they control the city, and I think this war is going to solidify that control over Jerusalem um, in a way that you and I haven't seen in our lifetime.
Right.
And that is again prophetically significant because that's going to lead to them building their third temple. So the red heifers, all this stuff that's happening, convergence. Uh, I just keep an eye on the news. I don't watch the news anymore like I used to.
Nah.
I don't watch any particular channel. I mostly just read if it's like from Reuters or from the AP or from international news and things like that. I'll kind of follow that. And if it's domestic news, I'll have to look at it through at least 3 or 4 different lenses before I make up my mind because everybody's throwing their
You don't
bias
know.
into it, and
Yeah.
so
Mm. Well, man, this has been awesome. And last thing is this: if you are sitting out there and you are fearful or you are anxious, um, and you're wondering, man, where do I stand in all of this stuff? If you've never come to know Jesus as your Savior, we have talked about it numerous times today. Jesus died for you. He shed his blood so that you could be free. And it's just like if you got a speeding ticket and you were standing before a judge and the judge said you're guilty and you know you're guilty, and somebody stands up there and says, yeah, he's guilty, but I'm going to pay his fine. And the judge says, because that fine's been paid, you can go free. And legally, that's what happened. Jesus paid your fine for your sin and paid the debts. And legally, God has set you free in Jesus if you just accept that free gift. Now, that guy in that courtroom could have said, no, I don't want that guy paying my fine. I'll do it myself. And he would have had to pay his fine. And he would have had to suffer the consequences. It's the same thing with God. If you don't accept that free gift that Jesus paid your fine, then you will pay for it forever yourself in eternity in a horrible place that nobody likes to talk about anymore, but is real, a place called hell or the lake of fire after that. So we would just tell you, don't go through the tribulation. I believe Jesus is at the door. I think time is running out. I think we are seeing the end of time coming very quickly. I think we'll see it in our lifetime. So accept Jesus now while there is time. The Bible says today is the accepted day. Today is the time, or today is the day. Today is the accepted time of salvation. Do it now before it's too late. Pete, thanks again for coming on such short notice, man. But this morning when I was praying and everything, I was like, man, I got to call Pete, see if we can get him on. And just we're having so many people ask questions. I just feel like this is going to be something people need to see.
oh, glad I could be here, and glad I caught it. Glad and it was I didn't have a lot of time to think through all this, but like I was doing shoulders and legs today, so I cut my
Yeah, I know. I
squats
got you.
short a
I
little bit.
texted you on the way to the gym, or were you at the gym?
I was there. I was there finishing a coffee, and I was kind of like, I don't want to do squats today. And then you text me. I was like, oh, cool. So now I can shorten my workout a little bit. So
Yeah.
I did all my reps. I did all my reps. I didn't goof around like I normally did. I did them and got out. So
There you go.